Welcome back to Crimson Cast, part 2 of the calendar year opener here on Crimson Cast. I'm Galen Clavio. I'm solo for this one like I was on the last one. We'll have Scott joining me, I think, post-Penn State game this weekend for basketball. If you missed part 1, go back and check that out. Talked about IU football, college football landscape, college football playoff. Lot to talk about and revisit. Based upon everything that's happened here over the course of the last couple of weeks. So hopefully you enjoyed that one. We'll have more college football commentary coming up, and I'm going to dive a lot deeper. We'll get Taylor on, talk about the transfer class and all the different things going on there. As there's more news coming soon. Indiana's in for a bunch of players that were on some playoff teams. There's some other guys in the portal that came in at the last second that Indiana may be in on. So the roster not yet complete, and Indiana's done a really good job in the transfer portal so far in football. We're waiting until the dust settles a little bit more, then we'll talk about that. But we want to talk about IU basketball on this show. Before we get started, just a reminder that we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Follow them on the socials, on Instagram, on X. They do an awesome job of showcasing their products, and really just, of course, they're the good brand. Like they do a wonderful job of figuring out what you want to wear and then figuring out how to make it. So looking forward to some new releases from them coming up here relatively soon, as they've got some more basketball stuff coming out from across the college basketball landscape that is a lot of fun. I've got several non-IU college basketball pieces because that's what I like. I like college sports, and so I've been able to attire myself in a variety of things. The DePaul hoodie that I bought a couple of years ago is kind of a joke. Coming in handy now. DePaul's not bad anymore, because Chris Holtman up there doing a pretty good job with things. So head over to homefieldapparel.com and use the code HOME23, HOME23, get 15% off your first order. Let's go ahead and dive in and talk about IU basketball. A nice win for Indiana last night. I'm recording this on Friday, January 3rd. You may be listening to it a couple of days later, but Indiana with an 84-74 victory over the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, pushing their Big Ten record to 2-1. And it was a game that, from a metrics perspective, didn't do that much for Indiana. Indiana was about a 9-point favorite, according to Ken Pom, going into the game, and they won by 10. So, you're not going to get a lot of extra credit there. There were certainly some positive things from Indiana. I was at the game. I watched the whole thing. There were also some things that I still have concerns about. And then this is where it's going to be, I think, interesting to see how this game ends up getting looked at within IU circles. What I've seen from a lot of the media coverage has been, Indiana looked focused. They had more drive. They had more energy. Maybe this is the start of something special. I agree with the first 3 things. I don't know if it really necessarily indicates there's a whole lot of difference from what we saw from Indiana over the first 2 months of the season and what we're seeing now. I don't necessarily yet believe that a new leaf has been turned over, because at the end of the day, Rutgers is probably the 3rd worst team in the conference. I think Washington and Minnesota are demonstrably worse. Minnesota is clearly the worst team in the conference. Washington's really bad as well. But Rutgers is not good. And so these are always difficult games to measure, because, there's that line, if you ever read Season on the Brink, where, the Bob Knight gets into this mode as they're trying to figure out what's going to happen with the season at the beginning of the Big Ten. They lose their first 2 games. They win 3 games against the bottom feeders in the conference. And, Knight says something along the lines of, to one of his assistants, like, are we ever going to catch another fish? Meaning, are we ever going to win a big game? They caught 3 little fish in that sequence in 86. And as John Feinstein wrote, it's like, they caught little fish, but we're not about to throw them back. It's kind of how I feel about this Rutgers game. Like, it's a little fish in the big scheme of things. And Indiana, you could make an argument, should have won by at least 10, maybe more, against a Rutgers team that not only was statistically worse than them, but was a team that was missing one of its best players in Dylan Harper in the game. But even with that, it sounds like I'm waving off the win. I'm not. It's more like, I think it's important to put these things into some level of context. And the context ultimately for Indiana is they needed a win and they've got to rack up wins in the Big Ten. They had to win this game, and they won the game. And I think that is a big aspect of why this was an important element for IU. There were some things in the game that I think were really, really positive, and if Indiana can figure out a way to bottle these things, then I like how it portends for the future. So to start off, you look at the way Indiana shot the ball. They shot 12 for 27 from three. They shot 44% from three, which is one of their best marks of the whole season. If you go and look at what Indiana's been able to do over the course of the year, what you find is that ultimately, a lot of Indiana's three-point shooting's been incredibly streaky. They had a couple of games where they'd hit 8 threes. They had a pretty good shooting game against Providence. They had a good shooting game against South Carolina, but the most they'd hit in the game was 8. This they hit 12, and you have to it really feels like you have to kind of scratch your head to go back to the last time Indiana shot and made threes at that rate. The last time they did it was the game last year against North Alabama. They went 12 for 24, had a slightly better shooting performance in that game than they had in this game. You go back to the previous year, and Indiana never got to 12 made threes in a game. They had 3 games in that last year that Trace Jackson Davis was here where they hit 10, and then they hit 11 at home against Nebraska. But this is just not a team that hits a lot of threes. So it was great to see Indiana hitting those threes. It was great to see Luke Goody able to hit. I think he had 3 threes on the night. Trey Galloway hit 3 threes. Mackenzie Mbako hit 3 threes. Miles Rice hit a 3. Anthony Leal had that crazy banked 3. Cannon Carlisle. There were a lot of good things that everybody that took a 3 hit a 3. And we know Indiana's going to have to do those kinds of things. They've got to hit from outside. The question is going to be, did Indiana, did they just have a good shooting night? Did they have a good shooting night that was aided by the fact that Rutgers is pretty pitiful on defense? Is this the beginning of a newfound confidence from deep? It's also a question of Indiana was almost forced into a lineup that was smaller because Malik Renew unfortunately went down with a knee injury a little over a minute into the game. Walked back, had an ice pack on his knee, but no other structural brace or anything like that. Didn't play, but 2 minutes the whole game. So the question is, you got a good game out of Omar Bala. We played 32 minutes. Was this a situation where Indiana was forced to go small and they benefited from it? Or, what level of factors went into Indiana shooting that well from outside? I don't think we entirely know. And we're going to need to see Indiana do this consistently before I think you can really put a ribbon on them and say, hey, great three-point shooting team now. But that's not to take away from the performance last night. I just think we got to pump the brakes a little bit on whether that is something that will be a harbinger for better, shooting from outside moving forward. But it's a good start. Second thing I'll note is the rebounding. The rebounding was very good. Indiana with an offensive rebounding percentage of 38%. That means of all the possible offensive rebounds Indiana could have gotten in the game, they got 38% of them, which is, if you look at the course of the season, they've only had 2 games where they did better in that category. One of them was the Louisville game, weirdly enough, where they got 48% of offensive rebounding chances and still lost the game by almost 30 points. And then the Nebraska game, the Minnesota game, not the Nebraska game, where they got 43% of offensive rebounding chances and did win that game pretty handily. So, the rebounding's been hit or miss. Offensive rebounding has been, I think, for Indiana, something that has grown in importance over time. Last year, they were not a good offensive rebounding team. They were 254th in the country in offensive rebounding. And even when Trace Jackson Davis was here senior year, they weren't that good of an offensive rebounding team. This year, 34% basically of offensive rebounding chances, 71st in the country. That's good. And that's one of those things that we talk about the 4 factors on this program a lot, which, just to reiterate, are effective field goal percentage, turnover percentage, offensive rebounding percentage, and free throw to field goal ratio. And right now, Indiana's offense is starting to make some inroads in terms of being at least on the right side of the top third of college basketball in all of those. And offensive rebounding has been their biggest jump from last year to this year. So that's good to see. That's, I think, has to be, and the fact that they did as well as they did without Malik Renew, where they were getting rebounds, offensive rebounds from a variety of sources. I mean, Omar Ballo had 7 of them and certainly deserves a lot of credit for that. And they had 4 team offensive rebounds, but they got 3 offensive rebounds out of Anthony Leal, and they got 1 offensive rebound each out of the 4 other starters. Defensively, they did a great job with defensive rebounding. They really limited what Rutgers could do on the glass. And I think overall, if I'm looking at the numbers, I think you have to go back to the Sam Houston State game to find a game where Indiana did a better job at limiting their opponent's offensive rebounds. And again, that's important because that cuts down on second chances for their opponents. So I think there's some things to build on there. But it is kind of curious that Indiana has one of their best rebounding games in a game where they've only got 1 big. Will that necessitate a change in the way Indiana does business? I don't know, but it's something to keep an eye on. So those are the things that really stuck out for me. I mean, Indiana did I think a pretty good job of limiting turnovers. They only turned the ball over on 11% of possessions. Miles Rice only had 1 turnover. It was a bad one, but it was only 1 for the game. So that was nice to see. And, so there were a lot of things. The fact that Indiana wasn't relying so much on blocks, the fact that they were running an offense that generated a ton of assists. I think they had assists on 57% of their made baskets, which is a pretty good mark overall. And Rutgers was not really set up to try to generate assists themselves. So there were some building blocks that I liked. And again, I think when you look at the contributions you got from across the board, the fact you get a really good game out of Omar Ballo, especially the game after he didn't play at all due to things that we're still not entirely sure about. You get a really good complete game from Miles Rice. He goes 8 for 8 from the free throw line. That's nice to see. You get some good minutes from Anthony Leal off the bench. He actually plays more than Carlisle and Bryson Tucker. That's probably a good sign. You like that experience in the lineup. And you get Luke Goody untracked a little bit, get him shooting and hitting some threes. That's good to see as well. The things, I guess, that I look at the stats and I'm a little bit concerned about, and just being there in person, the biggest thing that stuck out, and I didn't realize it until I saw the numbers today, is this Indiana team just, they and I talked about this in the last basketball podcast, they just struggle so much with consistent play. And it goes both ways. Indiana in this game allowed Rutgers to have 2 separate runs, one that was a 13-0 run in the first half and one that was a 14-2 run in the second half. Indiana themselves had a 12-1 run that immediately followed the 13-0 run that Rutgers had in the first half. And then Indiana had a 13-2 run, essentially to start the second half, that was immediately followed by the 14-2 run that undid all of that, in the middle of the second half. And it's amazing when you're watching in person, if you haven't been to a game yet, you can feel when Indiana just stops playing effectively. And it's very weird to watch because it goes from a team that's got a lot of confidence and is playing really consistent and strong to a team that just kind of forgets to do the little things. And it happens on both ends of the floor. It happens defensively generally first, and then that tends to bleed over into the offensive side of things. And, at one point, Rutgers led 23-16. Then Indiana pushes it back out. They end up leading by 7 at half. You're like, okay, great, crisis over. Indiana pushes that lead all the way back out to, I think the high water mark, it was an 18-point lead. It was 56-38. And then it becomes, 50... I think at one point it got down to a 6-point game, and it could have been less, or it might have been a 5-point game. Ace Bailey had those 2 technical foul shots that he missed, hits the 3, and I remember sitting there in the arena and being like, now what? They scored a bunch of points in a cluster there, and I think it was like 58-52, I think was the score. And then Indiana hits a 3, hits another 3, hits another 3, hits another 3, and then all of a sudden they're up 71-57 and the game's over. And then of course we had the foul fest parade at the end. But it's always so disconcerting because there's a lot of talent on this team, and yet this has been a hallmark of the Woodson era for a long time, is these swoons where this team just they don't play consistently, and it ends up hurting them. And they were fortunate in this game because they were playing a Rutgers team that was really not good. I mean, Ace Bailey had one of the best games I've ever seen from an opponent in Assembly Hall. Had 39 points, 12 of 21 shooting, 4 for 8 from 3, 8 rebounds, 4 blocks. I mean, he was a monster. If he'd hit his free throws, he would have set the Assembly Hall opponent record for highest point total. And if he did his free throws, Rutgers might have been even more in the game than they were. But the rest of Rutgers was real bad. It was announced right before the game that Dylan Harper, who has been as good as Ace Bailey, maybe better, arguably, but that Dylan Harper wasn't going to play. It was his first DNP of the season. But this is a guy who, you go back and look at what he did. He scored 36 points against Notre Dame in a neutral site. He scored in his last 5 games 18, 24, 24, 22, and 16. Like, if he's playing, and he was like Ken Pom MVP for Rutgers 3 out of the last 4 games. Like, if he's playing, I'm not sure if Indiana wins the game. Indiana really benefited from the fact that Rutgers basically had to run their entire offense through one guy. So Indiana can count themselves a little bit lucky, but I also think that, when you look at Indiana and the way that they play, it's the lack of consistency that always I end up coming back to with this team, because you can explain away some of the aspects. You can explain away the 3-point shooting woes at times. You can explain away some of the turnover issues. But the consistency and that it's palpable, you can feel it, you can see it when it's happening, and it always seems to have a negative impact. It's just something that has to be fixed. And I'm not sure if it can be fixed at this point, because, again, it feels like it's been a hallmark of the Woodson era basically from the beginning. And we saw it on display last night. And again, I think Indiana to some degree gets lucky because Rutgers is bad defensively. Rutgers is 97th in the country defensively in Ken Pom. Rutgers is about the same as Indiana offensively, but that is entirely reliant on having 2 top 15 NBA draft picks in their roster, and they were missing one of them last night. So, I don't think Rutgers is completely non-functional, and it was nice to see Indiana win against Rutgers. I think they'd only won 3 of their previous 11 games against Rutgers, and unless they play them in the Big Ten tournament, Indiana doesn't have to play Rutgers again, which I'm okay with. No trips to the rack this year. But I look at Indiana, I look at the fact that, this Rutgers team, they do have a lot of flaws. They generally allow a lot of offensive rebounding. They allow a lot of 3-point shots, and Indiana did those things very well. They're not going to run into a lot of other teams in the Big Ten that have those types of weaknesses to exploit. And I worry that you pair that with the inconsistency issues that Indiana's got, and it's going to be real hard for Indiana playing like they did last night, as good as it looked, for that to carry over as they play some of these games coming forward in the schedule. So it's a mixed bag for me, in as much as I'm happy that they won. I'm happy that they got on track from 3. I'm happy to see that the rebounding was there. I'm happy that they were able to pivot away from the 2 big lineup because of Renew's injury and not only survive, but find different ways to go about things. All of that is positive. I just worry about where it goes from here. And look, maybe they use this as a springboard. They're able to go into the Palestra on Sunday and beat Penn State. That would be a big win. Penn State didn't look that great last night. They got a lot of help from the officials in that win at home versus Northwestern. But Penn State, at the end of the day, is still 12-2. Mike Rhodes has done a great job. That's a team that really pushes the tempo. It's a team that forces a ton of turnovers. It's a team that plays really good offense. It's a team that plays better defense than Rutgers and Indiana. And it's a team that, very similar to Indiana, they have a lot of assists on made baskets. They don't shoot the ball from 3. They're to some degree kind of like you look at them statistically, they're kind of a slightly better version of Indiana in a bunch of key factors. And, Indiana's going to have to figure out a way to handle Ace Baldwin defensively. They're going to have to figure out a way to deal with some of the different players that they're going to bring to the table. And I'm really curious to see how Indiana plays out with that. Is Indiana going to be able to use this Rutgers game as a springboard? You hope so. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Like, the expectation was Indiana was going to beat Rutgers, maybe lose to Penn State, but I think it's a winnable game. They're only a 5-point underdog on Ken Pom. They get USC at home next week, and USC is kind of in shambles. They've got to use this 3-game set to get themselves mentally right and focused, because that next stretch is really, really tough. Starting with that next Saturday game at Iowa, and then coming back for that Tuesday game at home versus Illinois. Illinois looks real good. They blew out Oregon at Oregon last night. It was not particularly close. Illinois looks pretty scary. Indiana's going to have to raise their game. And I hope that game last night against Rutgers was the start of that. I just worry because you can still, if you're watching, you can see some signs where you're like, this isn't really all fixed. And if you're going to exploit a team, I think Rutgers was the team that you were going to be able to exploit. I'm not sure how much that carries on as we move forward, but we'll see. So anyway, a mixed bag in some ways, but I do think there's some things to build on for Indiana. I really would like to see, we need to see what happens with Malik Renew. I think we still need to see Mackenzie Mbako becoming more assertive. I think it's good to see Trey Galloway looking more comfortable playing a lot more minutes. And certainly I think Luke Goody starting yesterday, maybe we see more of that. Maybe that gets him into a little more of a rhythm. He's up to 33% from three now. He had really struggled at the start of the year, but 33% is fine. And if you can get that at the 38 or 39%, which is, not far off from where he was last year, he was at 39% last year. His career average coming into the year was, about that. It was right in that 39 to 40% range. And ultimately, I think that's going to be a big factor. The threes in general are going to be a big factor for this IU team if they want to compete for a tournament bid. It's going to just have to be something they figure out how to get more factored in. And if you can pair that with ironing out those inconsistencies, not letting those runs for the opposition happen, keeping defensive intensity strong, there's a lot to build on. We'll just have to see what happens with all of it. Anyway, this was a relatively short second part. We're just talking about that one game. But we'll have a lot more to talk about as Indiana takes on Penn State this Sunday, as that game at noon at the Palestra. Some of you I know are going. I wish I was able to go. Spent all my money on playoff tickets, so I had to bow out of that trip. But someday we'll make it out there. And for those of you going out there, hopefully you have a great time, and hopefully Indiana will come away with a victory. So anyway, that'll wrap it up for us here on Crimson Cast, as Indiana basketball on the season standing at 11-3, 2-1 in the conference, and a big stretch of games coming up that are going to be very important for the Hoosiers as we move forward. We'll go ahead and break for now. My thanks to all of you for joining us. My thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody. And goodbye, YouTube and Spotify.